Now it's time for our sponsored perspective portion of the program, which is presented by USC Schaeffer Center for Health Policy and Economics. For that, I'd like to welcome onto the stage Douglas Dietrich, Director of the Institute for Liver Medicine at Mount Sinai Health System, Timothy Wright, Chief R&D Officer at Regulus Therapeutics, and then joining them for the conversation is Dana Goldman, Leonard D. Schaeffer Chair, and a Distinguished Professor of Pharmacy, Public Policy, and Economics at the University of Southern California.
Thank you. That was a really poignant discussion, I think, and it kicks off what we're about to talk about. Cures are really the paragon of medical innovation, the idea that we have a discovery that can restore people to health when they're sick. And so it's surprising that we lack so many real-world examples. And the examples we do have, I think, belie a fundamental tension that we have. On the one hand, we want to encourage innovation, as the previous discussion talked about. But on the other hand, once we have a cure, we want broad access to it. And this fundamental tension really plays out. One of the questions referred to, the woman referred to her child's eye disease. There's a disease called choroideremia, which is a rare hereditary disorder, for example, where you're lacking the ability to, basically the cells in the retina start to deteriorate. And so children start with night blindness, then their peripheral vision goes away, and eventually in adulthood, they lose central vision. Last year, there were some trials with gene therapy that were very successful and actually are able to restore sight to people who are blind. Okay, that's an example of a cure. It's for a rare disease, but let's think about what would happen if I said to you, what's the value of a cure for blindness? And suppose the ability to translate that to a broad population. It sounds like it's worth a lot, but suppose someone came out and priced it at a high level. There's already a 14-year difference in life expectancy between high SES people and low SES people who are minorities. And if we start developing cures and pricing them in those ways, we might be exacerbating already large health disparities. So the issues are great, and I can't think of two more important people to talk about these issues. Doug, you're the director of the Institute for Liver Medicine and professor of medicine at Mount Sinai, so I've just reintroduced you, so just so everyone's clear. But it seems like one of the most prominent examples of a cure is Hep C, new antiviral therapies that have really been dramatic in eliminating the disease. Can you talk a little bit about what it means from a patient and clinical perspective?
It's been absolutely extraordinary, actually. When I first stuck myself with a needle and got Hep C in 1977 as a medical student, there was nothing. There was nothing. I never actually, hate to quote Mickey Mantle, but it's like if I'd known I was going to live this long, I would have taken better care of myself. And there was just nothing on the horizon. And by 1983 or so, there was interferon, which was awful, terrible, almost like chemotherapy. One of my patients said it's like 12 months of PMS with a cold. And the cure rate was about 20%. So I failed that once, and I was cured the second time. So that was actually fine, but that was still in the 90s. So we had no medicine, no pills to take without side effects until about 2011. The first two drugs were approved, but they were along with interferon. So on top of interferon, they doubled the side effects. They increased the cure rate a little bit, but some from 20 to 40%. But it was actually, the side effects were worse than interferon alone. Telaprevir, both of those drugs were off the market. And then all of a sudden, in 2013, December 2013, with the first drug was approved and the second drug approved, both at the same time, actually, sofosbuvir and cimipravir. And we had an interferon-free, virtually no side effect cure for this disease. which is causing, 30 or 50,000 deaths a year. Number one leading cause of liver transplant. It's been absolutely astounding. And then a couple more years, we now have like 5 drugs and combinations on the market, 8 weeks, and about 99% cure rate. It's absolutely astounding, and there's virtually no side effects. So now we're talking about cure all the time. We're lucky about this virus, that it's a flavivirus, so it doesn't integrate into the genome, so it's not like HIV or Hep B. It sits out in the cytoplasm, so you can actually, when it's cured, it's cured. It's like West Nile virus or Zika virus, for instance. It doesn't stick into the genome. So we're actually curing these people, and it's actually hard to handle the numbers. I think Gilead published some numbers recently that the sofosbuvir-containing regimens have cured 500,000 people in the U.S. in the last 3 years, and 1 million worldwide. Cured, gone forever. We're actually having a party next week at Mount Sinai for the 700 cures, 700 patients that we've cured actually in the last 2 years with these new drugs. So I mean, the progress has just been absolutely phenomenal. Now, that's the good news. There's a little bad news too, unfortunately. There's sort of 2 bits of bad news. Number one is that it doesn't get rid of the risk for liver cancer. It lowers it, but it doesn't abolish it. So we still have people, baby boomers, who've had a lot of liver disease for a long time. Even after we cure them, they still get liver cancer. So we have to stay on top of that really carefully, making sure we screen for it, because if we find it, we can cure that too. But the other bad news is, the baby boomer epidemic. You've all seen that big, board between 1945 and 1965. New York State Department of Health just published this second epidemic boom. And it's not just New York State, it's all over the mid-Atlantic states and actually probably half the country of under 30, actually Hep C patients under 30 are the same size bump as the baby boomers now. And it's all IV heroin, actually. So our major goal, now that we have the tools to cure these people and we mostly can get it paid for, what we're really trying to do is capture those under 30s and cure them early, and then capture the rest of the baby boomers who actually haven't been tested. So the exponential science has just been like phenomenal, and the implementation of it is fantastic. But now we have to pull in the rest of those folks and try to get them cured. So in New York State, we just announced, our intention to abolish Hep C in New York State by 2020. So that may actually have something to do with the governor's plans for 2020, but I wouldn't venture into those political waters.
So I think it's quite a picture, and I'm struck by the fact that you had a party for the people who are cured, and I think the goal is, how do we have more of these parties? So, Tim, I'd like to move to thinking about what I'll call the supply side. We know there are incentives for innovation, and you know a lot about the drug development world, having headed development at Novartis and also advising the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates has been the most prominent philanthropists who has taken an interest in how we eliminate disease. Can you talk a little bit about what we can do on the supply side?
Sure. So I think it's important to keep into perspective this cure for Hep C, for example, didn't come without decades of research. And in fact, many pharmas were competing for that sort of magical set of molecules that would eventually replace interferon-based regimens. And so, it's important to keep in mind that the cost of that effort was tremendous. In fact, not just the cost to Gilead, who eventually succeeded with the optimal combination 8-week cure, but for those who didn't achieve that, who had other combinations that are effective, but perhaps not quite as effective as the Gilead combination. What's interesting also is that, as I've shared with a lot of my colleagues in pharma, and I'm now at a biotech, which is sort of a microcosm of that, different perspective, different size portfolio, different number of elements and variables. But all across the spectrum, I feel innovation is a very fragile entity. So pause there. Innovation is really fragile. Why do I say that? It's very easy to try to squeeze out efficiencies. It's very easy to say, well, let's focus on the big bets. Let's eliminate those things that become risky in one way or another. And so I heard a lot of discussion around orphan rare diseases. Those tend to be risky to work on. The biology, in many cases, is not as well known or worked out. There are relatively small populations of patients who are affected. I'm a huge advocate for orphan disease work, and in fact, one of my first programs at Novartis was working on Alaris, which at the time, it's an IL-1 beta antibody, had been steered towards asthma and rheumatoid arthritis, largely based on a commercial assessment of where this could be effective and also based on some biology. And I remember when I was asked to take over the program, the head of development said, so what do you think about the program? And I said, I think it's pretty risky, that the fact that it's not necessarily going to be competitive with other agents that are on the market, the anti-TNFs, based on the biology that I was familiar with. And he said, well, is it a valuable drug? And I said, I think yes, very much so, but most likely for some orphan diseases. And I will tell you that we got the mandate, go test it out. And it was a very efficient and effective way to evaluate the efficacy of that drug, now on the market, approved for multiple orphan indications, and never approved for the initial indications for which it was being studied. I bring that up because it would have been very easy for the head of research and head of development to tell me, well, what's the value in that? In fact, there were behind the scenes some commercial smirks and, do we really want to develop a drug for something where there may only be tens of thousands or fewer patients on the planet who are affected? And that's not a big pharma type of perspective. I think that this is a perspective that, as you were saying earlier, needs to be kept in mind no matter what company, what size company, what academic group is working on it is, what is the value to society and to the patient? And so I think it's important to keep in mind that innovation is fragile. It's very easy to squash it, and it requires champions, and it requires a support system that encourages innovation, and it's not something you simply prescribe. We're going to go create a novel drug for X. The biology may not be known. The techniques may not be known. You mentioned gene therapy for ocular disease. I can tell you when I was in medical school, that would have been a dream. And now it's a reality. So technology continues to evolve. Things that were not able to be approached even 2 years ago. The latest technology of CRISPR and similar recombinant DNA techniques in terms of correcting genetic mutations, both in vitro and in vivo, is phenomenal. And we'll see that play out over the next decade or two.
But you're right, Tim, there's a lot of strikeouts in this thing. I remember giving lectures about Hep C and the graveyard of Hep C drugs. I'm sure you've seen that slide, right? And the graveyard was pretty much full by the time we actually, hit one out of the park, actually with the first drug. So there must have been 10, 12, 14 drugs. Some of them were Novartis drugs.
Yes, many more than that, in fact. Many that died in the lab. And,
right, before they even got to these are the ones that actually got to the clinic, so we got to test them in the clinic on patients, and they flopped, actually, miserably.
Well, it's harder than hitting a Nolan Ryan fastball. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about how the playing field is skewed and how the controversy current controversy over pricing may exacerbate that. So let me explain what I mean by that. Type 1 diabetes came up earlier today. If you look at the spending over a lifetime of someone who's diagnosed with type 1 maybe in adolescence, you're looking at literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in spending. suppose we came along and we had stem cell therapy, or even better, suppose there was a pill that you could take and suddenly it would cure diabetes. From an economist's perspective, we'd say, that's fantastic, pay $100,000 for that pill. You don't have to go through a lifetime of checking your blood glucose, titrating your medicine, everyone's better off. But we know capitalism can be pretty harsh because, again, if we have a cure for diabetes and it costs $100,000, then we're creating access barriers. And so how does that, and so there's a lot of uncertainty right now. The playing field seems tilted. In fact, the analysts would probably say, why do you want to eliminate your market? And so the playing field is always tilted towards treatment rather than a cure. And how does that play into what we see on the clinical side, as well as what we see from an innovator's perspective? Well,
we certainly, to continue with the Hep C example, we had tremendous problems with access in the beginning, and they're still in a lot of states, actually. In Texas, for instance, I think if you're on Medicaid, the only way you can get treated for Hep C is to go to jail. You can get treated in jail, but you can't get treated on Texas Medicaid. And many insurance companies insisted on having advanced liver disease before they would treat. Because even though, from a long-term perspective, as Dana and I have discussed many times, it's such a no-brainer to cure this disease. In terms of quality-adjusted life years saved, we're talking $8,000 or $10,000, and break-even is like $50,000. So this is unbelievably cost-effective. And it's very expensive to die from liver disease. That's the problem. It costs about $500,000 to die from liver disease or to get a liver transplant, same cost. So why not spend the, whatever it is, cost now, the $100,000 now, to save that $500,000? Well, because the healthcare system, I think we heard from somebody that it's complicated. That there's a lot, it's disjointed, and incentives are all going in the wrong direction. So the insurance company's incentive, since they think you're going to change your insurance, the average time you spend on health insurance is 2.5 years in the US. So they only have a 2.5-year time horizon. They're not really interested in what happens 5 years from now, because they hope you're going to die on somebody else's dime, actually not theirs. Whereas Medicare, for instance.
Your point, though, I think that's an important point to emphasize. Maybe it'll come up in the Access panel, which is, from an insurance company's perspective, it makes sense to finance the treatment but not the cure. Because why pay the $100,000 up front? You would rather pay $10,000 a year, and because you'll only see the person for
right. And even within the insurance companies, they bucket their budgets so that the pharmacy budget is different from the hospital budget. So the pharmacy guy doesn't really care if you get hospitalized for the disease that he could have treated, but because it comes out of somebody else's budget. Mm-hmm. And it sounds terrible. It's really awful. And I think this is a very good reason why we need to align our incentives, and put everything together. And I'm not saying there's a simple, easy answer, but if you give us in the medical world the tools, and let us do it, and without actually having, perverse incentives, fighting everything every way, then I think we can probably do it much better and much cheaper in the long run.
Tim?
Yes, I guess just first to debunk the myth that it's the intent of pharmaceutical companies to avoid cures and actually develop chronic therapies. I think that is having worked at 2 of the largest pharmas in the world and now 2 biotechs, that's anything, that couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, I think as a physician, primary, and scientist, secondary, nothing would make me happier than to have a single pill cure. And in fact, the intent all along is about curing the patient if possible. That being said, some diseases are complex. Type 1 diabetes happens to be a complex genetic disease for which there are multiple known genes and others that are still being discovered. There may be ways to sort of come around and do a backdoor treatment with stem cells or with some kind of implant. But short of that, and replacing the cells that have been destroyed, and suppressing the immune response to those newly transplanted cells. It isn't something that's likely to be a single pill cure, at least in the near future. That being said, I can tell you there's tremendous research being done on type 1 to try to look across the spectrum to see where improvements can be made. And at my last job just down the street in La Jolla at Caliber, we actually had Juvenile Diabetes Foundation funding to do several programs, innovative programs in drug discovery for type 1 diabetes. And this is not unusual. They have funded a lot of work across biotechs and academia. And so I think there is this need to fuel the system, not knowing when the payout will be. And I think earlier we heard about the increased NIH funding. I think that's a step in the right direction, because out of that will come the next wave of discoveries and innovation that, in parallel with discoveries from other parts of the private sector and pharmaceuticals, will lead to the cures of the future.
Great. Well, that's an optimistic message, and it's where we're going to have to leave it. I'm sorry we didn't have more time, but thank you to the Hill, and thank you to our panelists for engaging.
Thank you.